verse. And here's where we started last week. For verse 7, if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. So Christ has better equipment to work with because, see, the first covenant, if it had been faultless, then we wouldn't have needed a second covenant, which tells us something about the first covenant. It wasn't faultless. In other words, it was faulty. There were problems with the first covenant that kept priests from being able to be effective priests. Because no matter how good the priest was, there was problems with the covenant. The covenant was dependent upon people's performance. And people don't perform well. So the priest could do his best, be smart, know his Torah, do everything right, and yet there's a fault in the covenant, and that fault affected everyone. So this is an important verse. Because this verse establishes that there's a faultiness with the old covenant and faultlessness with the new covenant. I want you to catch the term first and second. And please, let's, for purposes of studying, understand that the author is simply trying to pare down the covenants into an effective two-covenant standard. No Bible scholar would ever argue that there's only two covenants in the Bible. There's more than two covenants. I mean, Noah had a covenant. Right. Abraham had a covenant. David had a covenant. We already got three right there. We ain't even made it to Moses. We ain't even talked about Moses. Moses got a covenant. Now we got a new covenant. But for purposes of study, the author of Hebrews does something that Paul does well in Galatians. He simplifies it down to first and second. Okay. So with first covenant, we're dealing with the nation of Israel. With second covenant, believe it or not, we're still dealing with the nation of Israel. That's for another study. But the new covenant is we're going to find out in Hebrews 8 that he's going to make that covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. He doesn't say, I'm going to make it with Americans. I'm going to make it with Gentiles. He says, I'm going to make it with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, because he's going to expand the borders and bring a bunch of people into the house of Israel and the house of Judah through a man named Jesus. Okay, that's how he's going to put you and me into the new covenant. What I want to do tonight is I want to dwell on the faulty covenant for a little bit, if we could. Okay? Because according to this verse, there was a faulty covenant. Israel was functioning beneath a faulty covenant. There was a problem. We need to know what the problem was, because if we don't know what the problem was, we won't really be able to celebrate how great Jesus is. Yeah, that's true. Time out. You say, easy to celebrate how great Jesus is. He raised Lazarus. He walked on the water. He healed. None of that stuff counts when you get to talk about Jesus as a great priest. Remember? What verse 6 say? He's a better priest. Why? Because he has a better covenant built on better promises. Not because he's a great healer. Right. Not because he fed the 5,000. So we need to find out what made his covenant better. And one good way to do that is to show you what equipment Moses was working with. What was the priesthood working with that came before Jesus? That one, then when we get to the faultless covenant, you'll see the glory in what God has in store for you and I. Amen. All right? So the faulty covenant, I want to make 7. That sounds like a lot, especially as slow as I tend to teach. It sounds like a lot of points, but we'll go through them carefully. But I want to give you 7 Old Covenant facts, and I want to say that these are not the only 7 Old Covenant facts. There could be 7 more, and probably 7 more, and 7 more. But I wanted to pick the highlights. And here's something that was very important to me as I did this. I want to give you 7 Old Covenant facts, and I don't ever want to go into the Old Covenant to do it. Not tonight. Now, why would we do that? Because you and I are living on the other side of the Old Covenant. We're on the other side of the cross. Yeah. It's good for Bible study to know what it felt like on pre-cross. Right. We need to know some of that. But for day-to-day living, you need to know what it is on the other side of the cross, right? I mean, if you want to put this thing into action, you're going to need to know what it looks like from beyond the resurrection. So I want to give you all of these facts about the Old Covenant while doing it inside of the New Testament. Because I want to show you what the New Testament writers were looking at when they looked back on the Old Covenant. Because if we do it from inside of the Old Covenant, the perspective changes. And you'll walk away seeing something different because you can't see Jesus in your scope. Okay? He's not on your horizon yet. He's too far out. Now, it's worthwhile to get into that. We'll save it. But I want to do it from the New Covenant perspective. So here's number 1. These are Old Covenant facts. Number 1, the law was good. All right? The law was good. Romans chapter 7, verse 12. And it's always a little bit unfair. I bet if I say anything over these next however long we're together, I'll say this 100 times. It's not really fair for me to give you one verse. I want to give you 5. Yeah. But time's sake won't always allow us to do 2 chapters in front, 2 chapters behind. That's how I like to study. Okay. So every now and then we're just going to read one and try to give you the context to get into it. Romans chapter 7, verse 12. Do we have that? All right. Therefore, now I hate starting you with one verse that starts with therefore, because if you get a therefore, you need to know what it's there for, right? But such is the nature of you only can get into so many verses. But let me tell you what Romans 7 is up till this point, okay? Romans 7 opens with a metaphor about divorce. That's all it is a metaphor. It's not the Apostle Paul's theology on divorce, but it sounds something like this. If a woman is married to a man, and by law, she is bound to that man as long as that man does live. But if that man dies, she is freed from her husband so that she can be married to another man. Paul's not giving you the theology of divorce. He's simply restating the law for a bunch of Jewish Christians. And he's saying to them, wouldn't you agree that this is the law? He says, well, congratulations, because Christ has come and died on your behalf so that you could be freed from your first husband, so that you'd be free to marry another husband. That's good news. That's how Romans 7 opens. What's he talking about? He's saying, hey, Israel, you're not able to get out of the marriage because God didn't let women divorce men under the law. Guess why? Because God didn't want you to be able to divorce him. He didn't want you to be able to leave him. He said, and that's bad news because the law's a tough taskmaster and you need out of it. And if you have to die to get out of it, what good's that? Now you're dead. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're out of the marriage, but you're dead. And so Paul says, so Christ died on your behalf. In other words, Jesus died as you. He took the wife's part in the relationship, knew that she couldn't get out of the relationship, so became the husband in the relationship and died, or became the wife in the relationship and died and said, now, I'm going to die as you so that you can relive. We call that resurrect. You can resurrect and marry another, and the metaphor gets odd. The metaphor gets strange because the same guy that dies as you get to marry after you resurrect. That's just Paul saying to you, hey, don't you realize what has happened through the death of Christ? And that leads us up to Paul saying, here's what I found about the law. He's a tough taskmaster. He's a tough husband. I was doing okay until somebody told me what not to do. He said, in the moment they told me what not to do, that's all I was obsessed with. Paul said, I didn't know it was called covetousness. I didn't know it was called lust until someone said, thou shalt not lust. And Paul said, then I found that which had been dormant in my life suddenly became outrageous. I was lusting like crazy because I was told not to. Right. He said, so I found that the moment the law entered, sin revived and I died. Wow. And he said, therefore I've come to a conclusion. The law is holy. The commandment is holy. It's just and it's good. In other words, Paul is saying, I've come to a conclusion. The law's not the problem. I am. The law just exposed who I am. The law just simply showed me what's wrong with me. I had the problem, I just didn't know what to call it. And then God said, thou shalt not. And I went, oh yeah, that's me. That one right there, that's the one, that's my problem. So Paul wants to establish, and so do I. The law was not faulty because it was bad, because it was cruel, because it was heartless, because it was cold. It was none of those things. The law was just, it was holy, it was good. It was not a mistake on the part of God. There was a purpose behind the law. And so let's start with the idea that the law is good. And if in grace we can get the idea that it was all bad and it shouldn't have been around. And I've even heard some outlandish thoughts about God and the law was, I heard someone this week say, I don't think God even gave the law. I think that man interpreted God that way because of his sin consciousness, and he gave law and called it God. We're getting crazy. We're getting wild and outlandish and calling it grace because we're not understanding covenant. So we're trying to come up with theories. We're trying to explain things away. Never try to explain things away in the Bible. Explain them into. Okay, don't explain them out of the book, explain them into the covenant.